so much for that. When Dolphin approached me and asked me whether I could share something about theology and woman after God's heart, there was immediately one biblical book that came to my mind, and that was the book of Esther. Actually, there isn't that many books that carry the names of women in the Bible. Ruth is one of them, Esther is the other one. With the book of Esther, I've got a personal story that started in Rwanda, and let me share that story with you. It's Rwanda, Advent 2004. A group of 3 women is sitting outside one of the churches where the remains of the victims of the genocide are still stored. They are taking their turns in reading the book of Esther aloud, and they begged me to join them. They've now reached the part where Esther risks her life by approaching the king uninvited to try to prevent a genocide instigated by Haman. The women stop in their reading, and one of them, Maria, leans back remarking, "You need to find loopholes of survival and resist destruction in times such as this. And if you can't find them, you need to be like Esther, be courageous enough to create them." Being courageous enough to find loopholes of survival in the midst of destruction that we observe, that for me was a challenge that went with me from Rwanda to wherever I went. And it basically went with me into my ministry. As I said, the book of Esther together with the book of Ruth are the only biblical books that actually bear women's names. And the book of Esther together with the Song of Songs are the only biblical books that do not expressively mention God, but are nevertheless religious topics. We look at the book of Esther, I think most of you will be familiar with the story. It is set in the diaspora. People in the 5th century before Christ are spread all around the Persian Empire, and the story unfolds itself at the time of Ahasuerus, usually identified with Xerxes I, who ruled between 486 and 465 before Christ. Cyrus, another major ruler by that time, had already defeated the Babylonians a couple of decades back, and quite a majority of the Jewish people had already returned from their diaspora back to Jerusalem, back to Judah. When it comes to wondering in exegetical terms in biblical history where the book comes from, it's pretty clear. It comes from diaspora. It comes from people who are longing for their religious, for their spiritual home, and who are facing hardship in an empire that had a different faith, a different society, different language, and different culture. The Esther story is set in Susa, which at that point in time was the capital of the Persian Empire. Esther and her cousin Mordecai, they are both Jews living in Persia, presumably as a result of the Babylonian exile about a century ago. And if we look at the book of Esther, there's 4 major plots that emerge. The first one is the story how Vashti, the previous queen, got banished. And then we have the story how Esther emerged as a queen. It's followed by the story of Mordecai saving the king, and Esther's and Mordecai's rescue operation on behalf of their people. The Esther story is a story that starts with a display of power. King Ahasuerus has been celebrating, and he's been doing so heavily for 180 days. And by doing so, he was showing off status, possessions, lovely meals, banquets. And finally, at the end of this long period of celebration, he wants to present Queen Vashti as his possession. If we look at the Hebrew original, the king is asking the queen to come and to wear nothing but her crown and to dance in front of the guests that he had invited for the banquet. And Queen Vashti is very flat, very open to response. She said, "Forget it, I won't do that." So, as a result, King Vashti gets banished and King Ahasuerus, after a selection process, decides on Esther as a new queen. Esther, an orphan, Esther, an underdog living in a foreign context, foreign society, foreign culture, and she was under the wings of Mordecai, who had adopted her. Esther, an orphan member of exiled people, is elected into a position of power. And then the story unfolds between the four main characters. We've got Queen Esther, King Ahasuerus, Mordecai, Esther's cousin and opponent to Haman, and Haman, the royal administrator, who is shown in that story as very keen on extending his powers. Mordecai then falls in disgrace for refusing to pay homage to Haman, but at the same time, Mordecai is the one who saves the king's life when he's given a chance to by detecting a plot against him. And obviously it was because Mordecai was only bowing down to his God, not to people. And he was furious about the lack of reverence and respect from the side of the Jew. And consequently, Haman secures the king's agreement that revenge should be taken on all the Jews. And in the days to come, plans are made for a genocide and spread throughout the empire. And we've got the first part of turning the tables. The whole Esther story is a story of turning the tables, of the unexpected, of the low ones emerging in high positions, of the least likely ones to resist, to offer strong resistance. So turning the tables, part 1, actually occurs during the night when the king can't properly sleep. He's looking for a bedside reading and is given the annals that record all the events that happened in the kingdom. And during his bedside reading, he discovers that Mordecai actually has saved his life and that he's never been rewarded for that deed. So in the morning, when the king has finally slept, he went to Haman and tasked him to do exactly that, to reward Mordecai, to parade him through the streets. And instead of being hanged on the gallows, Mordecai is paraded through the streets, much to Haman's displeasure. And yet the edict of ordering the killing of all Jews is still out. And then the Esther story starts, and we observe turning the table for a second time. Esther is the only one in the position to really make a change, to save the people, to change the king's heart. But she's to do that at a very high risk because there was an unwritten law. The story tells us about that if you approach the king's court uninvited, the king might decree death upon you. If the king approaches his golden scepter towards you, that means you're allowed to live. You may bring forward your request, but it was what we would say Russian roulette these days. You never know what the outcome was. So Esther takes some time to reflect. She takes some time to consider what she should do, and she's taking time to think about her own identity as a Jewish person in a different religious and cultural setting. And finally, when she's plucked up her courage to do, she approaches the king and is granted her life, and she can bring forward her request. And Esther is playing her resistance within the system by saying, okay, please, can you do me a favor and come to a banquet? I would love to prepare a banquet for you. And can you please, king, also bring Haman? So the king and Haman come. And it's only at a follow banquet that Esther reveals wishes that the genocide should be stopped. And from all different cultures of this world, we've got very strong images with Esther stretching out her arm and saying, this is the person who wanted to kill the people of God. So very strong intercultural images. Esther as an intercultural person who's been taken up in many different contexts, in women's gatherings and in women empowerment worldwide. So the edict that all Jews are supposed to be killed cannot be revoked, but what the king grants is that the Jews now have the right to defend themselves, to organize them, to get together, to form groups, to form an army, and to defend against those who are trying to slaughter them. So the allotted day for the genocide comes, and the Jews, well prepared to face their opponents, emerge from it victorious, while the opponents are killed in their numbers. So reversal, turning the tables upside down, is a major strand that runs through the whole book of Esther. We look at the book of Esther as a literary piece, as a piece of literature, then we could consider it a diaspora story. Why a diaspora story? First, because it talks about incidents in the diaspora. It talks about the experience of the Jewish people to live all around the planet as strangers, to be remote from what they consider their spiritual homes. And it talks about them to face persecution, to be slandered for their faith, to be in a constant position where they need to defend their faith. It's a diaspora story also because in diaspora stories you usually have main characters that encourage model behavior. And Esther is a model behavior because she invites us to emulate what it is that she did. And it's a diaspora story because it reconnects with a larger community and with a spiritual previous home, with the temple in Jerusalem. So the book of Esther, one of the biblical scholars says, is writing in diaspora. It's about identity under threat. And it's a book that talks about resisting. And I think resisting is something that is very much after the heart of a God who's been very outspoken in many prophetical books about issues of justice. So the book of Esther shows different ways of resisting. On the one hand, we have Esther, who kind of tacitly is playing the system against the system, very clever, very cunningly done, resisting from the inside. And on the other hand, we have Vashti and Mordecai, very uncompromisingly, openly confronting authorities and structures, and very verbal about their resistance. Within both kinds of resistance, the main characters are breaking written or unwritten law. Vashti refuses to be the wife as the society wanted her to be, just obeying every command of her husband, and she's saying no when the husband is asking something of her that violates her dignity as a woman, to dance stark naked, just clothed with a crown in front of his guests. And what happened was that her open refusal makes the wise men to believe that female resistance endangers the whole state, and the story tells about messengers that are sent throughout the whole country telling each and every man to make sure that their wives obey them because they've got a right to. So female resistance, as it's displayed in this story, actually shows the level of strength that women have. What did Esther do? Esther refuses to take an edict that prescribed death upon her people, upon a disadvantaged group as the final word. And she breaks the most likely unwritten law that nobody is supposed to break into the king's comfort zone without prior summons. She utilizes the very system's displays of pomp, the banquets, to get a platform for her plea. And it's here that she's really turning the tables. So we've got various forms of resistance in the book of Esther, and we've got one form of resistance that was very important for the generations to come. You can resist through remembering, and you can resist through celebration. And what emerged was a celebration that was called Purim. Many people today would say it's kind of a Jewish carnival festival where all the main actors of the Esther story put up a so-called Purim spiel or Purim play. It's an occasion where people make lots of noise, where people try to invite the neighbors, but also an occasion where in most countries Jewish women would go to areas where they usually would not go and see that the most disadvantaged are getting a voice and that they are getting whatever it is that they need for food. So in many countries, Purim has resulted in traditions of women speaking out for those whose life is under threat, often speaking out for fellow women in a very difficult situation of life. And Esther encourages us to be as outspoken and do likewise. So it's a therapeutic book. If you look at the story that Esther had, it's a book that made it into the biblical canon at a very late stage. It was not particularly liked during the first centuries by the theologians, but it was very much liked by the population, especially by those who themselves were in a situation of exile, who themselves were diaspora, because for them it strengthened their identity and it told them that there's always a chance that the tables will turn and you're not alone, God will be on your side. So the book of Esther is a story that says you can deal with the status quo, you can deal with power, and another life is possible. So the book of Esther projects a totally new life, totally new justice. It's a story that says that the powers that are can be driven out by a joint effort. So, and that joint effort for Esther also included that Esther was asking for community support, asking all the Jewish people to support her by fasting up front to encourage them spiritually to embark on that journey of resistance. It is also a story that allows for liberating laughter. Often, especially when living in exile, life is pretty tough. You feel you're not really understood in what matters to you most. Sometimes you don't understand what matters to the people around you. Often you're under threat of racism. Often you're under threat of being at the losing end of the economy. And the Purim stories and the reenactment of the Purim stories also provide lots of opportunities for laughter, for communities who've been pushed to the margins in their so-called host countries. And especially in Russia, these Purim plays were very strong in places where oppression of the Jewish population was strong as well. So Esther. I would call Esther a woman after God's heart. Why? Because Esther is living up to her own identity as a Jewish woman in diaspora, and she's standing up to it. She's a woman after God's heart because she's refusing to be victimized, she's refusing to become a victim, and she's refusing to get othered. Othering happens very quickly when we have a situation of diaspora and exile. She's a woman after God's heart because she's courageous. She picks up her strength from the faith she's rooted in. She's courageous and she's cunning. She's really analyzing the situation and then checking how best the tables can be turned. Esther's a woman after God's heart because she's refusing to be restricted by the do's and by the don'ts of the powerful ones. God made. And she's a woman after God's heart because she's acting confidently and proactively. And she's refusing to be reduced to traditional gender roles that tell her you as a woman will never change a thing. She as a woman changed a lot of things. And I would say she was simply the right person at the right time. And there's one verse in Esther 4:14 that I would like to leave with all of us. It says, in fact, we don't speak up at this very important time. Relief and rescue will appear for the Jews from another place, but you and your family will die. And then the most essential part, but who knows? Maybe it was for a moment like this that you came to be part of the royal family. And I think sometimes we as women, we need small reminders of what it means to have our Esther moments. Moments where we courageously step out into the open and try to change things and try to be courageous, try to live out our identity. So I've made small little bookmarks, and if you want to, you can place them in your Bible. It's with this verse from Esther 4. Who knows that you've come to the royal position for such a time as this? And I think the Esther book speaks to each and every of our destinations. And I've brought you something else. Esther is rooted in faith. And it's faith that enables her to stand up to the injustices, to the death she's observing around. I've got a mix of totally different seeds, and if you want to, you can pick one or two of it, put it in a pot and see what's happening, and while watching it grow, remember that your roots are also very strongly rooted in faith. And you may be surprised to see what beautiful flowers are emerging from there. Thank you very much.